When I left home to study theology at university almost 10 years ago now, I'm not sure I was prepared to encounter so much bad theology. My degree was a secular course, which meant that lots of the lecturers and other students weren't necessarily Christians. They'd chosen to study Christianity and religion in general purely out of academic interests. It's maybe a bit similar to how lots of people now are getting into Greek mythology after watching The Odyssey in the cinema. Any fans of the movie here tonight? Anyone see it in IMAX? Yes, Sam at the back, that's very good, love it. People are getting really into it, and I've seen lots of people in the last few weeks, for example, discussing the Greek concept of Xenia, or Zeus's law, as it's referred to in the film. And people debating whether or not Christopher Nolan's depiction is an accurate reflection of Homer's original poem. Maybe this is just my Instagram algorithm, I'm not sure. But the fact is, I've seen lots of people getting into Greek mythology, but I don't think any of them have been sacrificing to Poseidon. Or I hope they haven't, at least. In the same way, lots of people on my theology course were gripped by the stories of the Bible, but didn't have an active faith of their own. And if we're not careful as Christians, we're in danger of viewing theology in exactly the same way, an exercise of academic thinking and nothing more. We lump theology, the study of God, with all of the other ologies. It's like biology or sociology or psychology, just with different subject matter. It can be seen as the theory or head knowledge that belongs in big dusty books. But theology is not like any other subject. It's not just an interesting academic pursuit that allows us to massage our intellect. Good theology is the practice by which we don't only understand who God is and what he is like, but crucially, come to love him more fully. And the reason I encountered so much bad theology during my degree was not so much because I was coming across lots of inaccurate ideas about God, although there was a fair share of that. It was because it was the kind of study of God that is totally disconnected from the heart. And in my view, therefore, it completely missed the point. And that is because good theology leads to worship. Today's passage, as a heads up, is pretty mysterious and theologically challenging. But my prayer in this third installment of our preaching series, looking at the names of God, is that today we don't just grow in our mental understanding of God's nature, but that we also receive a fresh revelation from the Holy Spirit that fuels our love for him. Does that sound good? Yeah. Nice, okay. Let's turn to today's passage, which is Exodus chapter 3, starting at verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. And so Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. And then moving on to verse 10. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. 'I am has sent me to you.'" God also said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This shall be my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation.'" Moses has just spent the last 40 years in obscurity, and it's fair to say he's had a pretty colourful life up to this point. He was born into a Hebrew family in Egypt at a time when not only were the Hebrews enslaved, but Pharaoh, out of fear for their growing number, had ordered every newborn son be killed. Moses' mother, however, managed to keep him under the radar, and eventually he was placed into a basket in the Nile and picked up by Pharaoh's daughter, who ended up adopting him into the royal household. He lived what I imagine would have been a very comfortable life, until one day he kills an Egyptian that he sees beating one of his fellow Hebrews. And when Pharaoh finds out, Moses flees to a place in the desert called Midian. There he finds a new family and becomes a shepherd. And this is exactly where we find him in the story. No title, no servants. With blood on his hands, he's no doubt riddled with guilt, and alone with nothing but his thoughts and his sheep in the hot isolation of the desert. One day, while tending his sheep, he notices a single bush that is on fire. Being a desert, wildfires would not have been common, and back then, can you imagine, there were no government alerts to give you a heads up. This sight would have grabbed his attention in the same way that fire would catch all of our eyes, but what's different about this is that though the bush is burning, it is not consumed. Moses can see the flames, but presumably no smoke, and the bush remains perfectly intact. That's when God speaks to him, and they have a conversation. He hears a voice that says, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." God says that he has heard the cry of his people and has come down to rescue them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a place flowing with milk and honey. And Moses, the murderer who fled to the desert, is the one God has chosen to lead his people into freedom. And so perhaps, understandably in verse 11, Moses asks, "Who am I to go to Pharaoh and bring the people of Israel out of Egypt?" Apparently, that's the wrong question because God doesn't really answer it. I don't know if Moses was maybe fishing for a compliment at this point, but he doesn't get one. God doesn't say, "Oh, you are Moses, who I've created for just this purpose. You've had the finest education in Egypt, you've got a strategic mind, and you know the political landscape you're about to walk into." No, God simply says in verse 12, "I will be with you." That is all that matters. So Moses tries a different question and asks, "Well, when I go to the Israelites and they ask me, 'What is the name of this God who has sent you?' what should I say?" In other words, he's realized that the better question is not, "Who am I?" but "Who are you?" And this is one of the most significant things any of us could ever ask. Who is God? What is he like? If God is real, his nature is perhaps the most consequential thing for our lives. Is the creator of the universe good? Is he all-powerful? Does he know that I exist? Does he care about me? Can I know him? And so what does God say? Verse 14. God said to Moses, "I am who I am. Say to the Israelites, 'I am has sent me to you.' And say to them, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name, the name you shall call me from generation to generation.'" I'm pretty sure this was not the answer that Moses was expecting. I imagine he thought God would have introduced himself a little more descriptively. At that time, names held a lot more meaning in people's minds than they do for us, and they were often quite literal. Whereas in our culture, by and large, our names are just sort of labels we use to distinguish between different people, in the Bible, people's names almost always describe something about who they are or what they've done. Abraham, for example, the man from whom God's people are descended, means father of many nations. Makes sense. And Moses here means drawn out of the water, because he literally was drawn out of the water by Pharaoh's daughter. So I expect Moses imagined God would say something more like, I am the creator, or I am the all-powerful one, or God Almighty, as Christina spoke about last week. But he does not describe himself in those terms. He says, I am who I am. And at first glance, it almost seems like God is avoiding yet another question. You can imagine Moses thinking, well, I am who I am. That doesn't really tell us anything. It's like God has just said, oh, I'm me. But not so. If you're up for it, I'd like to get a bit technical and delve into some of the Hebrew language used here. So God has said, I am who I am. In Hebrew, it's Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. And then he sort of repeats himself and tells Moses to say that I am, or Ehyeh, has sent me to you. And then that the Lord, the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you. So hang on a minute. Which is it? Which is God's name? Is it I am who I am? Is it just I am? Or is it the Lord? Well, it's kind of all of the above in a bit of a mysterious way. At this point, it's important to know that whenever you see in the Bible the Lord in all caps, it's not actually translating the Hebrew word for Lord. In Hebrew, it's actually these 4 letters which will appear on the screen, which are the equivalent of our consonants Y, H, W, and H. And our best guess is that this is pronounced Yahweh. But we don't really know for sure, partly because ancient Hebrew didn't have any vowels when it was written down, and partly because the Jews would not even say it out loud for fear of using the Lord's name in vain, one of the 10 Commandments. And so instead, whenever they read this word, they would say Adonai, which means the Lord. Hence why we read in our Bibles the word Lord. The challenge for us, though, in our English translation, is that we miss how similar the words Yahweh and I am are. It's maybe easier to show visually. We can see here that they both share the same root word, which is haya, meaning to be. Ehyeh is the first person of that verb, so I am. And Yahweh, while there is some debate about the best way to translate it, is most likely the third person of the verb to be. So something a bit like he is. The fact that God does not introduce himself in descriptive terms speaks volumes. He can't be put into a box or a neat category. He just is. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I can completely demystify this passage for us today, but I do believe that there are some clear insights we can draw out from the way that God reveals himself here. The first is that God exists. Hopefully that's not too controversial a thing to say in church. God says, I am. He is. I remember when atheism used to be cool. Growing up at school, I had friends who were really into people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, who were kind of atheist celebrities. My friends read their books, and we'd regularly engage in spirited debate about the existence of God. These days, however, very few people I meet are proud atheists. That might not mean that they are actively Christians, But there does seem to be a growing realization in society that the promises of secularism have failed us, and Richard Dawkins is no longer cool. When we remove God from the picture and claim that we are the masters of our own destiny, we end up carrying a weight that we are not equipped to bear. Suddenly, everything falls to us. You only have one life, and you have to get it right. And when failure inevitably comes, and people let us down, there's no one to fall back on, and there's no solution, ultimately, to the pain and hurt that we see in the world around us. And so it's no wonder people are looking for answers. Increasingly now, people like to describe themselves not as atheists, but as spiritual, or generally open-minded. But rejecting atheism and embracing spirituality is not the same as acknowledging the God of the Bible. The solution to the world's problems is not a sort of vague form of spiritualism, but a God who is real and who exists. Not as a character on the pages of this book, like Zeus in the Odyssey, but as one who is very much alive and present in this world and whose existence has direct relevance to our lives. And that is because God is objective, not subjective. We don't worship a metaphor or a symbol. We worship a person with a name. In my generation, there's this idea that everyone can have their own truth, or you do you. So the Christian God might be true for you, but the Muslim God or the Hindu gods might be true for you. But actually, some truths can't coexist. And it can't be the case that the God of every religion is true. The Christian claim is that there is only one God. It's not the case that God is what you make of him, or that he is true for you but not for me. Whether or not we believe in him, or whatever we think of him, he is who he is. His nature is not dependent on what we think or how we feel. And that is because, to my next point, God is not caused by anything. When Moses asks God who he is, God basically says, I just am. No explanation, no story or history of how he came to be. He just is. This one is a real mind-bender in my opinion, because everything in this world that we could use as a reference has come from somewhere. There is not a single thing in the universe that has not been preceded by something else. We all have parents, and they had parents, and so on. But that is not true for God. In the same way that the fire Moses saw was not dependent on the bush for it to burn, God is not dependent on anything to exist. He always has been. He always will be. And it is he who is the cause, ultimately, of everything we see today. And he does not change. Point number 4. It's been said that change is the only constant in life, basically one of the defining characteristics of the world we live in. Just think about the last 10 years in this country. We've left the EU, fundamentally changing how we're positioned on the global stage. We've had a pandemic, which has uprooted how many of us now live, work, and communicate. We've had 6 different prime ministers, and the electorate in Clacton almost voted for an intergalactic bin as their member of parliament. Change is a part of life, for sure, but it is not the only constant. Another way of translating I am who I am is I will be who I will be, or even who I am, I will be. God does not change. If he was good yesterday, he's good today. If he's powerful now, he will be powerful forever. And he's not fazed by the changes we see around us. I might be, if I'm honest. Every week it seems to me there's a new AI model that makes my job just a little bit more redundant. But I need to remind myself to fix my eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. Because the changing world we see around us is only temporary, but God is eternal. He's not worried about AI. He's not fazed by the changing political landscapes. All these things pale into insignificance compared to him. But that does not mean that God is somehow passive or doesn't care. Hopefully, we have in our minds by now a picture of the sheer greatness and otherness of God. He's not like us. He's in a category of his own. He's the very basis of existence. He doesn't change. But if we stop there, we're in danger of painting a picture of God that looks more like a product of Greek philosophy than Christian theology. If Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, were sitting in this room and listening to this preach, he'd probably be nodding along so far. God does not change. He's not caused by anything. He just is. But for Aristotle, God was a sort of passive force in the universe around which everything is set in motion. He described God famously as the unmoved mover. But that is not the picture of God outlined in the Bible. Let's not forget in our passage that we are in the middle of a conversation between God and Moses. God is saying that he has heard the cry of his people and intends to save them from slavery in Egypt. So yes, we believe God is all these great things and is in a category of his own. But the remarkable truth is that God is not aloof. He also comes close. He's personal, and he intervenes in our lives. And that is because, to my last point, he loves us. The story we've just read holds these two realities together of God's greatness on the one hand and his closeness on the other really well. If we turn our attention back to the setting of this encounter for a moment, Moses meets God at Horeb, referred to as the mountain of God. And the type of bush here specifically is a thorn bush. Now, Mount Horeb, as we read on in a few chapters, is the place where the 10 Commandments are given. And the 10 Commandments, and the law in general, represent that standard God has for us that we can ultimately never live up to on our own. Ultimately, the law reveals our sin, our brokenness, and our need for a Saviour. And I think it's no accident that God meets Moses there through a thorn bush. Thorns actually appear quite a bit in the Bible, and almost always in a negative context, referring to things like pain, sin, and trouble. Just a couple of examples. In Genesis, near the very beginning, we have thorns and thistles coming out of the ground, representing the curse of sin after Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit. In the New Testament, we have thorns in the parable of the sower, which refer to the worries of life. And we have the thorn in Paul's side, representing torment that he experienced. God could have appeared to Moses in any way, anywhere. Like a chariot in the sky, or a storm, or an earthquake. But instead, he comes to Moses and meets him where he is. Racked with guilt, having run away from the consequences of his sin and caught in the thorns of life. We have a mountain, we have the problem of sin, and we have thorns. Let's read on. It says, Moses turned aside to see this great sight. And when God sees that Moses has turned to look, he says, Moses, Moses, the kind of repetition reserved for intimate greetings. God comes to him in his pain, and Moses turns to God and is met with the warmest, most loving kind of greeting. And what's the next line? Verse 5. Don't come any closer. Stay back. Take your shoes off because you're standing on holy ground. It's kind of like, which is it? God, are you close or are you far? Next he says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, as far as we know, Moses' father was no one remarkable. The only reference to him up to this point is just one verse in chapter 2 where he's described as a man from the house of Levi. So God is the God of all of these titans of the faith, Abraham and Isaac, the ones with the dramatic stories of miracles and demonstrations of power. But he's also the God of Moses' so far unknown, unnamed Father. He is great, all-powerful, in whose presence we cannot come too close. But he's also the God who sees us, who hears us, and has come to save us. And that brings us to the coming of Jesus, where God takes on human flesh and is born on earth as a man. Jesus says, "I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate of the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine." And my personal favorite, before Abraham was, I am. Do you see it? I am. He's saying, I am the God that met Moses in the thorn bush. I am that same God who is eternal, who does not change, who has come to set his people free. And yet, we read in Philippians 2 that Jesus did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Saving Israel from Egypt was only the beginning, a foretaste of what was to come. It's ultimately through Jesus that we see God's greatness and love come together. He came to the mountain of Calvary and took on a crown of thorns. He bore our sin on the cross, and through his death and resurrection has offered us freedom. And the only proper response to this is worship. I don't know if many people here are familiar with the actor Shia LaBeouf of Transformers fame. I think it's safe to say he's quite a troubled guy in many ways, but he's recently become a Christian. And in an interview a few months ago, he was asked what he would say to Jesus if he met him. And he pauses. And he says, "I wouldn't say anything." And he bursts into tears. And he says, "I'd kiss him. I'd kiss his feet." That is good theology. He gets it. If I were asked that, I'd probably come up with some complex theological question, or maybe ask Jesus for guidance in my life. But Shia LaBeouf gets it. Like the woman with the alabaster jar who pours out the expensive perfume over Jesus' head and kisses his feet, covering them with tears. It's undignified. It's messy. But it is the only proper response to who God is. And that is my prayer, that today we would have a fresh revelation of God, the one who is, the great I am, who does not change, who is eternal, the one in whom we have our being, and yet who makes himself known to us, who meets us in the thorns of life, receives a crown of thorns, and dies in our place so that through repentance we can be free from sin and be with him for eternity.